Chapter 1:1 The Tiredness You Can't Sleep Off. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't touch. You can go to bed early. You can sleep 8 hours. You can wake up on time and still feel worn down. Not exhausted in your body, but heavy in your chest, flat in your mind, uninterested in things that used to feel simple. That's the tiredness most people struggle to explain. So they don't explain it. They say things like, "I'm just tired," or "I've had a long week," or "I guess I need a vacation." Those answers feel acceptable. They don't alarm anyone. They don't invite questions, but deep down you know that's not really it. Because vacations end. Sleep helps, but only briefly. Weekends pass, and the feeling returns by Sunday night. This kind of tiredness follows you. It shows up when nothing is technically wrong, when your life looks fine from the outside, when people assume you're doing well, and that makes it even harder to talk about. Because how do you explain being tired of a life you're supposed to be grateful for? Most people never find the words for that, so they carry it quietly. They keep going. They keep functioning. They keep showing up. And over time, that tiredness becomes familiar. At first, it feels like a phase. You tell yourself you're just in a busy season, that things will slow down soon, that once you get through this part, you'll feel like yourself again. But the season stretches. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. And the tiredness changes shape. It's no longer sharp. It's dull. It doesn't scream for attention. It hums in the background. You still laugh. You still work. You still do what needs to be done. But there's less excitement, less curiosity, less presence. You're there, but not all the way there. And that's when people start blaming themselves. They wonder what's wrong with them, why they can't just push through, why they feel drained when nothing dramatic has happened. So they try harder. They add routines. They optimize their mornings. They listen to podcasts about motivation. They promise themselves they'll get back on track. But this tiredness doesn't respond to effort because it's not caused by laziness. It's caused by endurance. Endurance without honesty. When you live in a way that doesn't quite fit, your body adapts, but your nervous system keeps score. You can ignore that score for a long time, but eventually it shows up as fatigue you can't explain. This tiredness is often emotional. Not emotional like sadness. Not emotional like anger. Emotional like carrying things that were never processed. Emotional like constantly adjusting yourself to fit expectations. Like choosing what's practical over what's true. Like telling yourself, this is fine, when it isn't. And the hardest part? You get good at it. You get good at being the reliable one, the capable one, the one who doesn't complain. You get good at showing up even when you don't feel present, at answering "how are you?" without thinking, at minimizing your own discomfort. That skill keeps your life stable. But stability has a cost. The cost is energy, not physical energy, emotional energy. The energy it takes to suppress small truths every day. Truths like, this isn't what I imagined. I feel disconnected. I don't feel fulfilled. I don't know how much longer I can do this. Those thoughts don't disappear. They get buried, and buried things don't go away. They turn into tension. They turn into numbness. They turn into this deep, persistent tiredness. This is why rest alone doesn't fix it. Because rest restores the body, not alignment. You can rest all you want, but if you keep waking up into the same life that drains you, the tiredness returns. That doesn't mean your life is wrong. It means something inside you is asking for honesty. Not change yet, not action yet, just honesty. Honesty about what costs you energy. Honesty about what you're forcing yourself to tolerate. Honesty about how much effort it takes just to feel okay. Most people skip this step. They rush to solutions. They rush to fixing. They rush to convincing themselves things aren't that bad. But this tiredness is information. It's not a flaw. It's a signal that something important has been ignored for too long. And ignoring it doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. You adapted. You coped. You did what you had to do. That version of you deserves credit, but it doesn't need to run your life forever. This chapter isn't about fixing anything. It's about naming something that's been quietly present. Because once you name it, it loses some of its power. And once you stop pretending you're just tired, you can finally start listening to what that tiredness has been trying to say. Chapter 2. When I'm fine became automatic. At some point, I'm fine stopped being an answer. It became a reflex. Someone asked how you're doing, and the words come out before you even check in with yourself. I'm fine. I'm good. Busy, but good. The tone is right. The timing is right. The conversation moves on. And that's usually the goal. Because pausing to tell the truth feels risky. Not because the truth is dramatic, but because it's inconvenient. The real answer might require explanation. It might invite concern. It might make things awkward. So I'm fine becomes a shortcut. It keeps things smooth. It keeps you moving. It keeps you from having to feel too much in public. At first, it's intentional. You know you're not fine, but you don't want to get into it. You don't have the energy. You don't want to burden anyone. You don't even fully understand what you'd say. So you say, I'm fine, and promise yourself you'll deal with it later. But later keeps getting postponed. And over time, something subtle happens. You stop noticing the gap between what you say and what you feel. I'm fine stops being a cover. It starts being the default. You say it so often that it stops feeling like a lie. Not because it's true, but because you've repeated it enough times that your nervous system accepts it as normal. This is how honesty erodes quietly. Not through denial, through habit. You don't wake up one day deciding to disconnect from yourself. You drift there. One polite answer at a time. One deflection at a time. One it's not that bad at a time. And because nothing explodes, you assume nothing is wrong. But something is happening underneath. You start editing yourself without realizing it. You stop mentioning what feels heavy. You stop talking about what disappoints you. You stop admitting when you feel lost, bored, or stuck. Not because you're ashamed, because you've learned that it's easier not to go there. Eventually, even when you're alone, you stop asking yourself how you're really doing. You stay busy. You distract yourself. You scroll. You plan the next thing, anything that keeps the question quiet. How am I really? Because that question feels like it might open a door you're not ready to walk through. So instead, you stay functional. Functioning becomes the measurement of health. As long as you're working, as long as you're paying bills, as long as you're meeting expectations, you tell yourself you're okay. But functioning is not the same as being well. Functioning is survival with good posture. It looks stable from the outside, but it requires constant effort to maintain. And effort sustained long enough turns into fatigue. That's why this chapter matters. Because I'm fine is often the sentence people hide behind when they don't feel safe telling the truth, even to themselves. It's not dishonesty, it's self-protection. You learned somewhere along the way that being low maintenance was valuable, that being agreeable was appreciated, that being strong meant not needing much. So you adapted. You learned how to keep things moving even when you felt disconnected, how to smile through uncertainty, how to reassure others while quietly questioning yourself. That version of you probably got praised. You're so put together. You handle things so well. I don't know how you do it. And those comments felt good at first because they confirmed that your effort was working. But over time, they created a trap. If people see you as fine, you feel pressure to stay that way. If you've always been the one who handles things, it feels strange to admit when you can't. So you keep saying, I'm fine, even when the words feel hollow. And the more hollow they feel, the harder it becomes to stop saying them. Because if you stop, you might have to confront questions you've avoided. Questions like, what do I actually want? What am I tolerating that I don't need to? How long have I been living on autopilot? Those questions don't have quick answers. They require stillness. They require honesty. They require patience. And when your life is built around momentum, stillness feels threatening. So I'm fine becomes a way to keep momentum alive. It's easier to say than I don't know. It's safer than I'm unhappy. It's simpler than something feels off. But here's the quiet truth. The cost of I'm fine isn't paid immediately. It's paid slowly, in lost energy, in dullness, in a background sense of dissatisfaction you can't quite name. You may start to feel less present in your own life, less connected to your days, less excited by things that once mattered. And because there's no obvious cause, you assume it's just how adulthood feels. that this is normal, that everyone feels like this, that this is just what responsibility looks like. Sometimes that's partially true, but sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's a signal that you've been ignoring your internal experience for too long, that I'm fine has replaced curiosity, that coping has replaced honesty. This chapter isn't asking you to stop saying, I'm fine out loud. It's asking you to notice when you say it internally, to yourself, because that's where it matters most. If you never check in honestly, you don't give yourself the chance to understand what you need. And without understanding, change feels impossible. Not because it is, but because you don't know what you'd be changing toward. So for now, there's nothing to fix, just something to notice. Notice how quickly you move past your own feelings. Notice how often you minimize your experience. Notice how familiar it feels to say, I'm fine, without checking. Awareness doesn't demand action. It just creates space. And space is where the next part of the story begins. Chapter 3. The difference between gratitude and suppression. There is a lesson most people learn early in life. It usually sounds reasonable. Sometimes it even sounds wise. Be grateful. Other people have it worse. Don't complain. At least you have. On the surface, those ideas aren't wrong. Gratitude matters. Perspective matters. Recognizing what you have can steady you in difficult times. But something subtle happens when gratitude is used the wrong way. It stops being appreciation. It becomes suppression. Suppression doesn't look aggressive. It looks mature, responsible, controlled. You don't explode. You don't spiral. You don't fall apart. You simply tell yourself that what you feel isn't important enough to acknowledge. You downplay it. You rationalize it. You push it aside. And you call that gratitude. At first, it feels like strength. You feel proud of yourself for not being dramatic, for keeping perspective, for staying grounded. But over time, something starts to feel off. You notice a quiet disconnect between what you say and what you feel. You say you're grateful, and you are. But there's still a heaviness that doesn't lift. You list reasons you should be happy, and they're valid, but something inside you remains unsettled. That's the moment gratitude quietly crosses into suppression. Not because gratitude is bad, because it's being used to silence something that needs attention. Suppression is not about denying reality. It's about denying yourself permission to respond honestly to it. You tell yourself things like, I shouldn't feel this way. This isn't a real problem. I'm lucky compared to others. I don't have a right to want more. Those thoughts don't come from cruelty. They come from conditioning. You learned at some point that wanting more could be seen as ungrateful. That dissatisfaction meant weakness. That contentment meant maturity. So you trained yourself to stay quiet internally. You learned how to coexist with discomfort instead of questioning it. And again, this works for a while. Suppression is very effective in the short term. It keeps you stable. It keeps you functional. It keeps you socially acceptable. But the cost shows up later. It shows up as emotional flatness, as low-level resentment you can't place, as a constant sense that something is missing without knowing what. That's because suppression doesn't erase feelings. It stores them. Stored emotions don't stay neatly organized. They leak out sideways, through irritability, through exhaustion, through disengagement, through numbness. You may find yourself less patient than you used to be, less curious, less tolerant of small frustrations, and you don't know why. After all, you're grateful. You remind yourself of that often, but gratitude, when it's real, expands you. Suppression contracts you. Real gratitude feels warm, grounding, present. Suppression feels tight, heavy, restrictive. The difference is subtle, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Real gratitude doesn't require you to deny your pain. It can coexist with honesty. You can be grateful and dissatisfied, grateful and tired, grateful and aware that something isn't working. Suppression doesn't allow that complexity. It forces a choice. Either you appreciate what you have, or you admit you want something different. So most people choose appreciation, not because it's truer, because it's safer. Safer to tell yourself, this is fine, than to admit, this doesn't fit anymore. Admitting something doesn't fit doesn't mean you reject everything in your life. It means you're paying attention. But attention is exactly what suppression avoids, because attention leads to questions, and questions lead to change. And change feels risky, so instead of asking questions, people reinforce gratitude as a shield. They stay polite internally. They stay reasonable internally. They stay quiet internally. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to separate what you genuinely appreciate from what you've simply learned to tolerate. That's the quiet danger. Tolerance masquerading as gratitude. You tolerate routines that drain you. You tolerate conversations that feel empty. You tolerate expectations that no longer match who you are. And every time you feel discomfort, you neutralize it with perspective. It's not that bad. This is just life. I should be thankful. Those phrases don't solve anything. They delay awareness. This chapter isn't about abandoning gratitude. It's about rescuing it, about letting gratitude be what it's meant to be. Appreciation for what supports you, instead of a tool to silence what doesn't. You don't need to feel guilty for wanting alignment. You don't need to feel ashamed for noticing friction. And you don't need to earn the right to acknowledge your own experience. Gratitude that requires self-erasure isn't gratitude. It's survival. And survival has a place, but it's not meant to be permanent. You can honor what you have and be honest about what costs you too much. Those two things are not opposites. They're signs of maturity. The kind of maturity that doesn't just endure life, but listens to it. And listening is where things start to shift. Quietly, without force, without rebellion. Just with honesty. Chapter 4. Holding it together as an identity. At some point, holding it together stopped being something you did. It became who you are. You didn't plan it that way. It happened gradually. You were capable when things needed to get done. You were calm when others were stressed. You stepped in when something fell apart. And people noticed. They relied on you. They trusted you. They stopped worrying as much when you were around. At first, that felt good. Being needed feels like purpose. Being dependable feels like value. Being the one who can handle things feels like strength. So you leaned into it. You learned how to stay composed, how to think clearly under pressure, how to keep your emotions from interfering with what needed to be done. You told yourself this was maturity, and in many ways it was. But something subtle happened as that role solidified. You stopped being someone who handles things and became someone who is expected to handle things. The difference matters. When it's a choice, it's empowering. When it's an expectation, it's heavy. Over time, you noticed that people came to you less to ask how you were and more to assume you were fine. They didn't check in the same way. They didn't worry about you the same way. They trusted that you'd manage. And you did. You always did, which made it harder to admit when you didn't want to anymore. Because when you're the strong one, struggling feels like breaking character. It feels like letting people down, like disrupting the balance, like becoming a problem instead of a solution. So you adjusted. You kept your doubts quiet. You handled your exhaustion privately. You told yourself that this was just what adulthood looked like. Being reliable, being composed, being steady. But holding it together all the time requires energy most people never see. It's the energy of constant self-monitoring, of checking your tone, of managing reactions, of deciding which parts of yourself are acceptable in each situation. You don't fall apart because you can't, because falling apart would mean losing the role you've built your life around. So instead, you tighten, you become more controlled, more reserved, more distant from your own emotional signals. Not because you don't have them, because you don't feel safe letting them surface. The role works. You stay respected, you stay functional, you stay in control, but the role also narrows you. You stop asking yourself what you want. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop giving yourself permission to be uncertain, because uncertainty doesn't fit the image. And when you've been the one who has it together for long enough, even you start to believe it's the only way you're allowed to exist. You forget that it was a strategy, not your essence. That's when the role becomes an identity. And identities are hard to outgrow. Not because they're true, because they're familiar. Letting go of the role doesn't just mean changing behavior. It means grieving the version of yourself that held everything together when it needed to. That version kept your life stable. It protected you. It got you through situations that required strength. You don't abandon that version, you thank it. But you also don't let it run your life forever, because holding it together indefinitely has consequences. It disconnects you from vulnerability, from spontaneity, from parts of yourself that don't perform well under control. You may notice that joy feels muted, that excitement feels distant, that rest doesn't fully restore you, because rest doesn't release a role. Only honesty does. And honesty feels risky when you've built your life around being the one who doesn't need anything. This is why many people who have it together feel lonely in a way they can't explain. They're surrounded by people. They're respected, they're trusted, but they're not fully known. Because the role doesn't leave room for that. It leaves room for competence, not complexity. This chapter isn't asking you to stop being reliable. It's asking you to notice when reliability has replaced authenticity, when being capable has come at the cost of being real. You don't have to dismantle your life. You don't have to make announcements. You don't have to drop the role all at once. But you do need to recognize that it is a role, and roles can be adjusted, expanded, softened. You're allowed to be someone who handles things and someone who feels deeply. You're allowed to be steady and uncertain. You're allowed to be strong and honest about when you're tired. Holding it together helped you survive, but it doesn't have to define you forever. Sometimes the next step isn't learning how to handle more. It's learning how to let yourself be seen without everything being under control. That's not weakness, that's growth. And it begins quietly, the same way this role began, with awareness. Chapter 5. The Quiet Cost of Being Responsible. Responsibility rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. A little here, a little there. One obligation layered on top of another. At first, responsibility feels grounding. It gives structure to your days. It gives meaning to your choices. It gives you a sense of being needed. You learn how to show up on time, how to follow through, how to put what needs to be done ahead of what you feel like doing. And again, this isn't wrong. Responsibility builds lives. It keeps things moving. It creates stability. But over time, responsibility can quietly become the reason you stop questioning your life. Because questioning feels indulgent when people depend on you. You tell yourself there are bills to pay, people counting on you, commitments you made that you can't just walk away from. So you delay honesty, not because you don't see the misalignment, but because acknowledging it feels irresponsible. You begin to associate responsibility with endurance, with staying, with tolerating, with pushing through. And the longer you do that, the harder it becomes to separate what's truly necessary from what's simply familiar. Responsibility has a way of expanding into every available space. It fills your calendar. It fills your mental bandwidth. It fills your sense of identity. You become the responsible one, the one who doesn't take risks, the one who keeps things steady, the one who thinks things through. And slowly, that version of you crowds out other possibilities. You stop imagining different paths because they feel unrealistic. You stop entertaining new ideas because they feel disruptive. You stop listening to desire because it doesn't come with a plan. Desire starts to feel childish, unrealistic, impractical, dangerous. So you learn to manage it. You tell yourself that wanting more isn't necessary, that contentment is a choice, that discipline is more important than fulfillment. And again, this works. You keep moving forward. You stay afloat. You do what you're supposed to do, but the cost shows up quietly. You notice a low-grade resentment toward your days, toward your routines, toward the very responsibilities you once took pride in. Not resentment toward others, but toward the situation itself. And that resentment doesn't feel fair. After all, these are the things you chose. So you turn the frustration inward. You tell yourself to be more grateful, to stop complaining, to grow up. But resentment doesn't respond to shame. It responds to acknowledgement. The truth is, responsibility without agency becomes a burden. When you feel like you have to stay instead of choosing to stay, even good things start to feel heavy. And when responsibility becomes the reason you don't allow yourself to want more, it starts to limit you instead of support you. This is the quiet cost. Not burnout that looks dramatic, not collapse, just a slow erosion of enthusiasm. You still get things done. You still meet expectations, but you feel less alive while doing it. You may catch yourself thinking things like, "This is just how it is. I can't afford to change. It's too late to start over. I should just be happy with what I have." Those thoughts sound mature. They sound grounded. But often they're a way of avoiding a deeper question. Not what should I do, but why does this feel so heavy? That heaviness isn't a failure, it's feedback. Feedback that responsibility has started to replace choice. That your life has become something you manage instead of something you participate in. And again, this isn't a call to abandon responsibility, it's a call to understand it. To notice where responsibility has quietly taken over decisions that were once alive. Where it has turned "I want to" into "I have to." Where it has convinced you that wanting something different is reckless. Responsibility doesn't mean sacrificing yourself indefinitely. It means responding to reality with wisdom. And wisdom includes listening to what drains you as much as what sustains you. This chapter isn't about quitting. It's about recalibrating. About remembering that responsibility is meant to support a life, not replace it. You're allowed to question the shape your responsibility has taken. You're allowed to notice when it's become too heavy. You're allowed to admit that endurance has limits. Not because you're weak, because you're human. And acknowledging that doesn't dismantle your life. It gives you a chance to carry it differently, with more intention, with more honesty, with more room to breathe. Chapter 6. Burnout that doesn't look like burnout. When people hear the word burnout, they picture something dramatic. They imagine stress, breakdowns, exhaustion so obvious it can't be ignored. They imagine someone overwhelmed, frantic, on the edge. But that's not the burnout most people live with. Most burnout doesn't announce itself. It blends in. It looks like boredom, like apathy, like a quiet loss of interest in things that once mattered. It looks like waking up without dread, but without excitement either. You still function. You still show up. You still get through the day. Nothing is on fire. And that's why it's so easy to miss. This kind of burnout isn't loud enough to demand change. It's subtle enough to normalize. You tell yourself you're just in a rut, that everyone feels like this sometimes, that it's just part of getting older. So you adjust. You lower your expectations. You shrink your emotional range. You stop hoping for too much. And because the pain isn't sharp, you assume it's manageable. But manageability isn't the same as health. This burnout comes from sustained misalignment, from doing things that don't quite fit for too long without acknowledging the cost. It comes from days that are predictable but uninspiring, from routines that are efficient but empty, from conversations that stay on the surface because going deeper feels like work. You may notice that time feels strange. Days move quickly, but years feel blurry. You get through weeks without much memory of them. You look back and realize entire seasons passed without anything standing out. That's not because nothing happened. It's because you weren't fully there. Burnout like this dulls your senses. Not dramatically, just enough that life feels muted. Music doesn't hit the same. Success feels anticlimactic. Rest doesn't refresh. You're not miserable, but you're not alive in the way you used to be. And that's confusing because you're doing what you're supposed to do. You've built something stable. You've met responsibilities. You've avoided major mistakes. So why does it feel like you're just getting through things instead of participating in them? This burnout often shows up as detachment. You care, but less. You try, but half-heartedly. You engage, but from a distance. You might catch yourself thinking, it doesn't really matter more often than you used to. Not because it truly doesn't, because caring fully feels exhausting. This is what happens when effort outpaces meaning, when you're putting energy into something that no longer gives energy back. At first you compensate. You distract yourself more. You scroll more. You keep yourself busy. Busyness becomes a way to avoid noticing the emptiness. Because stopping might force you to feel it, and feeling it might raise questions you're not ready to answer. Questions like, is this all there is? Is this really what I want? How did I get here? What would it take to feel engaged again? Those questions don't come with easy solutions. They don't fit neatly into a schedule. So instead of asking them, people numb out. They lower the volume on their inner world. They become efficient, productive, emotionally neutral, And that neutrality can last a long time, years even. This is why so many people say they're fine but feel empty, why they're successful but unfulfilled, why they're stable but restless. Burnout like this doesn't force change. It waits. It waits until something interrupts the routine, a moment of clarity, a loss, a conversation that hits too close, a realization that time is passing faster than expected. Sometimes it waits until the numbness becomes unbearable, not painful, unbearable because of how little you feel. This chapter isn't meant to scare you. It's meant to help you recognize something early. Because burnout that looks like boredom is easier to address than burnout that turns into collapse. And recognizing it doesn't mean you need to act immediately. It means you stop dismissing your experience. You stop telling yourself this is just how life is supposed to feel. You stop normalizing emotional absence. Burnout isn't always about doing too much. Sometimes it's about doing the wrong things for too long, or doing the right things for the wrong reasons, or doing things without being honest about how they affect you. This kind of burnout doesn't respond to rest alone, because rest doesn't restore meaning. Only honesty does. Honesty about what drains you. Honesty about what feels empty. Honesty about what you've outgrown. You don't need to dramatize it. You don't need to make it a crisis. But you do need to stop ignoring it. Because numbness is not neutrality. It's a warning, a quiet one. And like most quiet warnings, it only grows louder when it's not acknowledged. Chapter 7. The life you learn to accept. Most people don't wake up one day and decide, this is the life I want. They arrive there gradually, not through a single choice, but through a series of small adjustments. You adjust your expectations a little. You compromise a little. You tell yourself this phase is temporary, and then you adjust again. You accept a job because it makes sense. You stay in a situation because it's stable. You follow a path because it's available, not because it's aligned. None of these choices feel wrong in the moment. They feel practical, responsible, reasonable, and because each step is small, you don't feel like you're giving anything up. You tell yourself you can always change later, that this isn't permanent, that you're just doing what you need to do right now. But later quietly becomes normal, and normal becomes unquestioned. This is how acceptance forms, not as surrender, but as adaptation. You adapt to schedules you didn't design, to routines that don't excite you, to expectations that slowly shape your behavior. At first, you notice the mismatch. You feel restless, you feel bored, you feel like something isn't quite right. But restlessness is uncomfortable. So you explain it away. You say things like, this is just part of growing up. Everyone feels this way. I can't expect to love every day. Those statements aren't false, but they're incomplete. They become dangerous when they're used to shut down curiosity instead of clarify reality. Because curiosity is what notices when something doesn't fit, and acceptance, when it comes too early, silences curiosity. Over time, you stop checking in with yourself. You stop asking, do I like this? Does this energize me? Is this how I want to spend my days? Instead, you ask, is this manageable? Is this stable? Is this good enough? Good enough becomes the new standard, and good enough is seductive. It doesn't hurt enough to demand change. It doesn't inspire enough to create momentum. It sits right in the middle, comfortable enough to stay, uncomfortable enough to drain you. This is where many lives settle, not because people lack ambition, because they learned how to live without listening. You may notice that your dreams didn't disappear. They just got quieter. They stopped insisting. They stopped interrupting. They learned not to bother you. You told yourself you'd revisit them someday, but someday rarely arrives without intention, and intention requires awareness. When acceptance happens unconsciously, it becomes a ceiling. You don't see it as a limit. You see it as reality. You stop imagining alternatives not because they're impossible, but because they feel unrealistic compared to what you already know. You begin to define yourself by what you can tolerate instead of what you desire. That shift is subtle, but powerful. Tolerance feels mature, desire feels naive. So you choose tolerance, again and again. And every time you do, you reinforce the life you're living. You don't hate it, you're just not fully in it. And that's the hardest part to articulate. Because if you hated it, leaving would be obvious. But when a life is acceptable, leaving feels unjustified. You start to feel guilty for wanting more. You think, nothing is wrong. Why do I feel like this? I should be happy. Why am I restless? Am I just ungrateful? So instead of questioning the structure of your life, you question yourself. You tell yourself to be more disciplined, more appreciative, more realistic. You try to adjust internally instead of externally, and that works for a while. But the longer you live a life you learn to accept instead of consciously chose, the more distant you feel from it. You may find yourself watching your own life from the outside, going through the motions, completing the tasks, meeting the expectations, but not feeling fully present. Not because you're disengaged, because you never truly decided. Acceptance without awareness creates a quiet form of resignation. Not dramatic, not hopeless, just muted. This chapter isn't about rejecting your life. It's about recognizing how it took shape. Because once you see how acceptance happened, you regain choice. Choice doesn't mean immediate change. It means awareness. And awareness interrupts autopilot. You don't have to undo everything you've built. But you do need to acknowledge where you stopped choosing, where practicality replaced alignment, where stability replaced curiosity, where good enough replaced honest engagement. You're not behind, you're not late, you're not broken, you adapted, and adaptation kept you safe. But safety is not the same as fulfillment, and acceptance doesn't have to be permanent, it just has to be conscious. Once acceptance becomes conscious, it can be renegotiated, quietly, at your pace, with honesty instead of urgency. That's where things begin to shift, not with rebellion, with awareness. Chapter 8. The resentment. You don't talk about. Resentment doesn't usually arrive as anger. It arrives as distance, as a subtle pulling away from things you once cared about, as irritation that feels out of proportion to the moment, as a heaviness you can't quite explain. Most people don't recognize it at first. They tell themselves they're just tired, just stressed, just having an off day. But resentment is patient. It doesn't need to be loud to survive. It grows quietly in places where honesty was postponed. It builds when you say yes too often, when you stay quiet to keep the peace, when you convince yourself that what you feel isn't important enough to matter. Resentment often begins with good intentions. You take on more because you're capable. You compromise because it seems reasonable. You let things slide because it's easier than addressing them. And in the moment, those choices feel mature. You tell yourself you're being flexible, that this isn't worth making a big deal about, that you don't want to create unnecessary conflict, so you absorb it once, then again, then again. Each time it feels small, but small things accumulate. And when they do, they don't disappear. They change shape. Over time, you may notice a low-grade irritation toward people you care about, toward routines you once accepted, toward responsibilities that used to feel meaningful. And that irritation confuses you, because no one did anything wrong. You weren't mistreated. You weren't forced. You agreed, which makes the resentment harder to justify. So instead of acknowledging it, you suppress it. You tell yourself to be more patient, to be more understanding, to be less sensitive. But resentment doesn't respond to discipline. It responds to honesty. Resentment is often grief in disguise. Grief for parts of yourself you sidelined, for needs you ignored, for desires you delayed indefinitely. It's the emotional response to living out of alignment for too long. And because it's uncomfortable to admit, people often redirect it. They become irritable about small things. They feel annoyed by people they shouldn't be annoyed with. They lose tolerance for minor inconveniences. Not because those things are the problem, because they're safer targets. The real source of resentment feels too big to name. You may even turn it inward. You criticize yourself for feeling this way. You judge yourself for being ungrateful. You shame yourself for wanting more. But resentment isn't a character flaw, it's a signal. A signal that something inside you feels unheard, that something important has been repeatedly overridden, that your internal no has been ignored for too long. Most people don't talk about this kind of resentment because it doesn't fit the narrative of being successful, responsible, or appreciative. They don't want to sound bitter. They don't want to seem entitled. They don't want to appear difficult. So they swallow it. And swallowed resentment doesn't disappear. It settles. It seeps into your tone, into your patience, into your capacity to care. You may notice that you're less generous emotionally than you used to be, less available, less engaged. Not because you don't care, because you're tired of giving without acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement was supposed to come from yourself. This resentment often surfaces in quiet moments, late at night, in the car, in moments of stillness when distractions fade. You might feel a sudden wave of frustration and not know why, or a sadness that doesn't seem tied to anything specific. That's resentment asking to be recognized, not acted on, not blamed, just recognized. Because once resentment is seen, it begins to soften. It loses its edge. You start to see it not as something ugly, but as something protective. It formed because something mattered, because you cared enough to endure, because you believed that sacrificing parts of yourself was necessary. And maybe at the time, it was. But what was necessary once may no longer be sustainable. This chapter isn't about expressing resentment outwardly. It's about acknowledging it inwardly, about allowing yourself to admit, quietly and honestly, where you feel depleted, where you feel taken for granted, even by your own expectations, where you feel like you've been living someone else's version of enough. Resentment doesn't mean you failed. It means you've reached the limit of endurance without alignment. And limits aren't weaknesses. They're boundaries trying to form. Listening to resentment doesn't mean you blow up your life. It means you stop pretending everything is fine when it isn't. It means you give yourself permission to notice what you've been carrying. And noticing changes things. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But enough to create space. Space for honesty. Space for choice. Space for a different relationship with yourself. Resentment fades when it no longer has to hide. When it's allowed to be information instead of a secret. And that's where the next shift begins. Quietly, without force, just with truth. Chapter 9. When wanting more starts to feel selfish at first. Wanting more feels natural. You want more time, more freedom, more meaning, more alignment between who you are and how you live. Those wants don't feel selfish in the beginning. They feel hopeful. They feel like possibility. But somewhere along the way, wanting more starts to feel inappropriate. You notice the shift when your desire is met with resistance, not from others, but from yourself. A quiet voice appears. It says things like, "You should be grateful. Other people would be happy with this. You're asking for too much. Be realistic." That voice doesn't sound cruel. It sounds reasonable. It sounds mature. And because it sounds mature, you listen to it. You begin to treat desire like a liability, something to manage, something to minimize, something that needs to be justified. You ask yourself questions like, do I deserve this? Is this responsible? Am I being selfish? And slowly, desire moves from being a signal to being a problem. This is where many people get stuck, not because they don't want more, but because wanting more starts to feel morally wrong. Especially if you've built a life that works, if you're stable, if you're doing okay. If nothing is obviously broken, you start to feel like wanting more is an insult to what you already have, as if acknowledging dissatisfaction automatically means rejecting everything else. So you make a trade. You trade honesty for loyalty, loyalty to your circumstances, loyalty to your past choices, loyalty to the version of yourself who worked hard to get here. You don't want to betray that version. That version sacrificed. That version endured. That version did what was necessary. So when desire arises, you suppress it out of respect. You tell yourself, this is the life I chose. I shouldn't want something different now. I owe it to myself to be content. But contentment can't be forced. And when it is, it turns into something else. It turns into compliance. Compliance with expectations. Compliance with routines. Compliance with a story that no longer fits. You may notice that when you think about wanting more, guilt shows up immediately. Guilt for not being satisfied. Guilt for feeling restless. Guilt for imagining a different life. That guilt doesn't come from wrongdoing. It comes from conditioning. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that desire should be moderated, that wanting too much leads to disappointment, that ambition is risky, that contentment is virtuous. So you internalize those messages. You learn to second-guess your own longing. You learn to dismiss it before it could get loud. And because you did this quietly, no one else noticed. They saw someone responsible, someone grounded, someone realistic. They didn't see the internal negotiation happening every time desire surfaced. The mental math. If I want this, what does that say about me? If I admit this, what do I have to change? If I honor this, who might I disappoint? So you kept desire theoretical. You thought about it occasionally. You imagined alternate lives in passing, but you never let it become real, because real desire demands response, and response feels like disruption. So instead, you minimized. You told yourself, I don't need that. That's not important. I can live without it. And you can. That's the problem. Humans are remarkably good at adapting. You can live without many things that would make you feel alive. You can survive in a life that doesn't fully nourish you. You can function in a role that slowly drains you. So the fact that you can live without honoring desire doesn't mean you should. But when desire is framed as selfishness, endurance becomes the default. You stay because leaving would feel indulgent. You settle because wanting more feels greedy. You endure because endurance looks noble. And over time, you forget that desire isn't asking you to abandon everything. It's asking you to pay attention. Desire is information. It tells you where energy flows, where curiosity lives, where aliveness returns. Suppressing desire doesn't make it go away. It makes it turn inward, into resentment, into fatigue, into numbness. This chapter isn't about chasing more for the sake of more. It's about recognizing that wanting alignment isn't selfish. It's honest. You're not wrong for wanting a life that fits you. You're not immature for noticing when something doesn't. And you're not disloyal to your past for acknowledging that you've changed. Wanting more doesn't erase gratitude. It deepens it. Because gratitude that includes honesty is real. Gratitude that requires silence is survival. You don't have to act on every desire, but you do have to stop shaming yourself for having them. Because when desire is treated as a flaw, people learn to live smaller than they need to. And that shrinking doesn't protect anyone. It just slowly dims the person doing it. This chapter is an invitation to stop arguing with your own longing, not to obey it, just to hear it, because hearing it changes your relationship with yourself. And that relationship is where the next shift begins. Chapter 10. The role you keep playing. Most people don't realize they're playing a role. They think they're just being themselves. But if you look closely, many lives are built around a version of the self that was shaped by necessity, not truth. You became who you needed to be: reliable, capable, reasonable, low risk. That version of you wasn't fake. It was adaptive. It formed in response to expectations, responsibilities, and circumstances that required you to show up a certain way. And once it worked, you kept using it. You learned how to speak in ways that were accepted, how to make choices that made sense, how to explain your life so it sounded coherent. The role helped you belong. It helped you stay safe. It helped you avoid disruption. It helped you avoid disappointment, both yours and other people's. So you leaned into it. You refined it. You became good at it. And eventually you stopped remembering that it was a role at all. It became your identity. That's when things get complicated, because identities don't just describe who you are. They tell you who you're allowed to be. Once you've lived inside a role long enough, stepping outside of it feels wrong. Not dangerous in an obvious way, wrong in a quiet, internal way. It feels irresponsible. It feels disloyal. It feels like breaking an unspoken agreement. You may notice that when you think about doing something different, a wave of resistance appears immediately. Not fear exactly, more like discomfort, a tightening, a sense that you'd be violating something important. That something is the role. The role says, this isn't like you. People wouldn't expect this from you. You're not the kind of person who does that. And because the role has kept your life stable, you trust it. You assume its warnings are wisdom, but often they're just familiarity protecting itself. Roles are efficient. They simplify decisions. They narrow options. They tell you how to behave without requiring constant choice. And the longer you live inside one, the more it feels like reality instead of preference. You may have noticed that people relate to you in predictable ways. They come to you for certain things. They expect certain responses. They rely on you to be consistent, and you are. But consistency has a cost. It locks you into patterns that are hard to break without confusing others and yourself. You may worry that changing would disappoint people, that it would disrupt relationships, that it would make you unrecognizable. But beneath those worries is something deeper. If you stop playing the role, who are you? That question is unsettling because roles come with scripts, and scripts come with certainty. Without them, things feel undefined. Undefined feels risky. So most people stay. They tell themselves, yeah, this is just who I am. I've always been this way. This works for me. And sometimes it does, until it doesn't. Until the role starts to feel tight, like clothing you've outgrown. It still fits technically, but it restricts movement. You notice that you're less spontaneous, less expressive, less curious. You may feel a quiet longing to act differently, to speak differently, to choose differently, but the role intervenes. It says, that's not practical. That's not realistic. That's not you. So you keep playing it. You show up the way you're expected to. And again, this works. Your life stays intact. Your image stays consistent. Your relationships stay stable. But something inside you starts to feel invisible. Not because others can't see you, because you stop showing certain parts of yourself. Those parts didn't disappear. They just went quiet. They learned not to interfere, and the longer they stay quiet, the harder it becomes to access them. This is why people often feel disconnected from themselves after years of doing everything right. They didn't lose themselves. They compartmentalized. They prioritized function over expression. They learned which parts of themselves were useful and which weren't. This chapter isn't about rejecting your role. It's about recognizing it. Because once you see it as a role, it loosens. You realize you're not betraying yourself by wanting something different. You're responding to growth. Growth always outpaces identity. And when identity doesn't update, it becomes a constraint. You don't have to abandon who you've been, but you do have to stop letting that version dictate who you're allowed to become. The role served you. It helped you survive. It helped you succeed. It helped you belong. You can honor it without letting it run your life forever. Because you're not meant to play the same role for your entire life. You're meant to evolve. And evolution doesn't happen loudly. It begins with awareness. With noticing when something that once felt natural now feels forced. With allowing yourself to imagine who you might be without the script. Not to act yet, just to notice. Because noticing creates space. And space is where change starts. Quietly, honestly, and without needing permission. Chapter 11. The fear of admitting this isn't working. There is a moment most people recognize, even if they don't remember it clearly. It's the moment when a thought forms quietly in the background. This isn't working. Not as a complaint, not as a crisis, just as a realization. It doesn't arrive with panic. It arrives calmly, almost politely. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because once you admit something isn't working, you've crossed a line. You can't unknow it. You can distract yourself. You can rationalize. You can push it aside. But the thought has already changed something. It has introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty feels threatening when your life is built on predictability. So instead of leaning into the realization, most people retreat. They tell themselves they're overthinking, that every life has hard parts, that nothing is perfect. Those statements are true, but they're often used to avoid a deeper truth. The deeper truth isn't, I'm unhappy. It's, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. That admission feels dangerous because it doesn't come with a clear next step. It opens questions instead of answers. Questions like, if this isn't working, what does that say about my choices? If I admit this, what am I supposed to do next? If I change course, what do I risk losing? Those questions feel heavy. They don't fit neatly into a schedule. They don't come with guarantees. So instead of answering them, people learn how to mute them. They stay busy. They stay distracted. They stay focused on short-term tasks. Anything that keeps the realization from settling. Because once it settles, it changes how you see your life. You may start noticing how much effort it takes just to maintain things, how often you talk yourself into being okay, how frequently you rely on "it's not that bad" as reassurance, and that noticing feels destabilizing. Stability has often been the reward for endurance. You endured, and things stayed intact. So the idea that something might not be working threatens that bargain. It suggests that endurance alone isn't enough. And that's uncomfortable, especially if you've built your identity around pushing through. Admitting something isn't working can feel like admitting failure, even when it isn't. It can feel like disrespecting your past effort, like invalidating the sacrifices you made, like questioning decisions you can't undo. So you hesitate. You tell yourself to wait, to give it more time, to be patient. And patience is a virtue until it becomes avoidance. The fear here isn't just about change, it's about responsibility. If you admit something isn't working, you may feel responsible for addressing it, and addressing it feels overwhelming. Not because you lack courage, because you don't yet see a clear path forward. So instead, you stay in the familiar discomfort. You choose known dissatisfaction over unknown possibility. That choice feels safer. And in the short term, it is. Because it doesn't require reimagining your life. It doesn't require conversations. It doesn't require uncertainty. It doesn't require disappointing anyone. It just requires you to keep going. And you can do that. You've proven it. But the cost of not admitting something isn't working is subtle. You begin to live with a low-level tension, a sense that you're out of alignment with yourself. You may feel disconnected from your own days, detached from your own goals, less present in moments that should matter. Not because you're ungrateful, because you're split. Part of you knows the truth. Another part is afraid of what the truth implies. That split requires energy to maintain. It creates internal friction. And friction, sustained long enough, turns into fatigue. This is why people often feel tired without knowing why. They're not just tired from doing too much. They're tired from holding opposing realities at the same time. Knowing something isn't working, and continuing anyway. This chapter isn't asking you to make that admission out loud. It's asking you to notice when you avoid it internally, when you sense a truth and quickly move past it, when you minimize a feeling before it has time to speak, when you tell yourself later without checking if later is realistic. Admitting something isn't working doesn't mean you need a solution. It doesn't mean you need a plan. It means you stop gaslighting yourself. It means you allow the truth to exist without immediately fixing it. That alone is a shift, a meaningful one. Because once you stop fighting awareness, it begins to work with you instead of against you. And the fear softens. Not all at once, but enough to create space. Space to think clearly. Space to feel honestly. Space to recognize that admitting something isn't working is not the end of stability. It's the beginning of alignment. Quietly, without drama, without urgency, just with truth. Chapter 12. Why change feels heavier than staying from the outside. It seems obvious. If something isn't working, you change it. If a situation drains you, you leave it. If a life doesn't fit anymore, you adjust. But inside, it rarely feels that simple. Because staying carries a weight you already know. Change carries a weight you can't yet measure. And humans tend to choose the weight they understand. Staying hurts in familiar ways. You know where the tension lives. You know which compromises you've made. You know how to brace yourself for another day. There's a strange comfort in that predictability. Even discomfort feels safer when it's mapped. Change, on the other hand, feels heavy before it even begins. Not because it's guaranteed to be worse, but because it's undefined. Undefined things ask more of you emotionally. They ask you to imagine, to anticipate, to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty is exhausting for a nervous system that's been trained to manage risk. So when you think about change, your mind doesn't picture freedom, it pictures effort. It imagines conversations you don't want to have, decisions you don't feel ready to make, mistakes you might regret. It imagines disruption. Staying avoids all of that. Staying lets you keep your routines, your explanations, your sense of control. Even if those things cost you energy, they don't demand reorientation. They don't require you to relearn who you are. Change does. Change isn't just about doing something different. It's about becoming someone new. And becoming someone new means letting go of parts of yourself that once kept you safe. That's why change feels heavier. It threatens identity. It threatens stability. It threatens the story you tell yourself about your life. The story that says, this makes sense. The story that says, I'm being responsible. The story that says, I know who I am. When change enters the picture, that story wobbles. And when the story wobbles, fear shows up. Fear doesn't usually say, don't change. It says things like, what if you regret it? What if it doesn't work? What if you're wrong about how you feel? What if you end up worse off? Those questions aren't irrational. They're protective. They come from a part of you that has learned to avoid unnecessary risk. So staying feels like a relief, a postponement of uncertainty. You tell yourself you'll revisit change later, when you're more prepared, when things calm down, when you have more clarity. But clarity rarely arrives before movement. It emerges during it. And waiting for clarity before change often means waiting indefinitely. Because staying keeps you busy. Busy managing, busy coping, busy explaining why now isn't the right time. And the longer you stay, the heavier change feels. Not because it's getting harder, but because you're adding more history to what you'd have to reconsider. More investments, more commitments, more reasons to stay. That's the trap. The longer you endure, the more endurance becomes the justification. You think, I've already made it this far. And that thought is powerful. It ties you to the past instead of orienting you toward the future. It makes staying feel logical, necessary, even when staying is what's draining you. This chapter isn't saying change is easy. It's saying the weight you assign to change is often imagined. Staying has weight too. It just spreads it out so thin that you stop noticing it. Until one day, you do. You notice how tired you are, how disconnected you feel, how much effort it takes to convince yourself things are fine. That weight didn't disappear, it accumulated quietly. Change concentrates weight, staying diffuses it, but diffused weight still weighs something, and over time it weighs a lot. This is why people often change suddenly, not because they weren't aware earlier, because the accumulated weight finally exceeded the imagined weight of change. They didn't suddenly become brave. They just reached a point where staying felt heavier than moving. You don't need to reach that point to listen. You don't need to wait until things break. Understanding this dynamic allows you to reframe the choice. Instead of asking, can I handle change? You can ask, what am I already handling? Instead of asking, is change worth the risk? You can ask, what is staying already costing me? Those questions shift the balance. They make the invisible visible. They remind you that no choice is weightless. You're already carrying something. This chapter isn't pushing you toward action. It's softening the fear around it. By showing you that change feels heavy, not because it's wrong, but because it's honest. Honest about uncertainty. Honest about growth. Honest about the fact that the future can't be controlled the way the past can. And that honesty is uncomfortable. But it's also alive. Alive in a way staying often isn't. Understanding that doesn't force you to move. It just gives you permission to stop pretending that staying is neutral. It isn't. It's a choice. And once you see it as a choice, something loosens. The fear doesn't disappear, but it stops being the only voice in the room, and that's when the next shift becomes possible. Chapter 13. The myth of the right time. The idea of the right time is comforting. It suggests that someday conditions will align, that clarity will arrive, that you'll feel ready. The right time feels responsible. It implies patience instead of impulse, wisdom instead of risk, maturity instead of recklessness. So people wait for it. They tell themselves they're not avoiding change. They're just being thoughtful. They say things like, now isn't the right time. I need to get a few things in order first. Once things calm down, I'll revisit this. I just need a little more stability. Those reasons make sense. They don't sound like fear. They sound like planning. And that's why the myth of the right time is so powerful. It disguises avoidance as preparation. At first, waiting feels productive. You gather information. You think things through. You imagine different outcomes. You tell yourself you're being careful. But over time, waiting becomes a pattern. You notice that the right time keeps moving. When one obstacle clears, another appears. There's always something else to handle first. Another responsibility. Another reason to postpone. And slowly, the idea of the right time becomes less about timing and more about comfort. Comfort with certainty, comfort with predictability, comfort with knowing what tomorrow will look like. The problem is, certainty rarely arrives before action. It arrives after. Most people who changed their lives didn't feel ready beforehand. They felt unsure. They felt conflicted. They felt scared. Readiness is often a story we tell after the fact. We look back and say, it felt like the right time, when what we really mean is, I survived the uncertainty. Waiting for the right time assumes that clarity comes before movement. But for most people, clarity comes from movement. It comes from trying, from adjusting, from learning as you go. The longer you wait, the more the right time feels like a requirement instead of a hope. You begin to think, I can't move until I feel certain. I can't change unless I know it will work. I can't risk making the wrong choice. And that expectation quietly paralyzes you. Because certainty isn't a feeling that shows up uninvited. It's a byproduct of experience. Without experience, all you have are predictions. And predictions tend to lean towards safety. They exaggerate risk. They minimize possibility. They focus on what could go wrong. So the future starts to look heavier than the present, even when the present feels draining. This is why people stay in situations they've outgrown. Not because they believe it's the best option, because it's the most familiar. The right time becomes a story that protects familiarity. It says, not yet, without ever specifying when. And because it never specifies, it never arrives. You may notice that when you imagine the right time, it's usually a time when nothing else is demanding you. No pressure, no obligations, no competing priorities. But life rarely offers that. Life overlaps. Responsibilities stack. Seasons blur. If you wait for a moment when everything is calm, you may be waiting indefinitely. This chapter isn't saying timing doesn't matter, it does. But timing isn't about waiting until fear disappears. It's about recognizing when waiting has become a habit, when postponement has become a form of self-protection, when later has replaced honest engagement. You don't need to force yourself into action, but you do need to be honest about why you're waiting. Are you gathering information or avoiding discomfort? Are you planning or postponing uncertainty? Are you respecting your pace or protecting familiarity? Those questions don't demand immediate answers. They just shift awareness. And awareness changes the meaning of waiting. Waiting stops being passive. It becomes intentional. You stop telling yourself a story about the right time arriving magically. You start noticing that time passes regardless. And with each passing season, something inside you either grows quieter or more insistent. Often what people call the right time is actually the moment they stop waiting for permission. Not from others, from themselves. They stop asking, am I ready? And start asking, am I willing to learn? That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because willingness doesn't require certainty. It requires honesty. Honesty about what you feel. Honesty about what you're avoiding. Honesty about how long you've been waiting. This chapter isn't urging you to act. It's inviting you to question a belief that may be keeping you still. The belief that clarity comes first. Sometimes clarity follows courage. Not dramatic courage, just the quiet courage to stop waiting for a moment that may never arrive, and to recognize that the right time is often not a feeling. It's a decision, made softly, without guarantees, with trust instead of certainty. Chapter 14. Letting go of the version that copes. There is a version of you that deserves more credit than it ever received. The version that figured things out when they weren't clear. The version that stayed steady when things felt uncertain. The version that learned how to cope. Coping is not weakness. It's intelligence under pressure. You coped by adapting, by minimizing needs, by prioritizing what was necessary over what was ideal. You learned how to keep things moving, how to stay functional, how to manage emotions so they didn't interfere with responsibility. That version of you wasn't wrong. It was protective. It formed in response to real demands, financial pressure, expectations, limited options, uncertainty. You didn't choose coping because you wanted to live small. You chose it because you needed stability. And coping worked. It kept you afloat. It helped you survive seasons that required endurance. It allowed you to build something when dreaming felt impractical. That's why letting go of this version feels so complicated, because it feels like betrayal. You may worry that if you stop coping, everything will fall apart, that the discipline you built will disappear, that the structure you rely on will weaken, that the stability you work so hard for will be lost. So you keep coping, even when the conditions that required it have changed. You stay in survival mode long after the emergency ended, not because you're unaware, because survival became familiar. It became your baseline. And when survival is your baseline, rest feels unnatural. Ease feels suspicious. Desire feels indulgent. Slowing down feels risky. The coping version of you doesn't trust ease. It trusts effort. It believes that vigilance keeps you safe. So when something inside you asks for more honesty, more expression, more alignment, coping steps in. It says, now isn't the time. Be practical. Don't rock the boat. Just get through this. And again, those responses once made sense. They kept you protected. But what protects you in one season can limit you in another. Coping is meant to be temporary. It's a bridge, not a destination. But when coping becomes identity, it stops being adaptive. It becomes constricting. You may notice that you default to managing instead of feeling, that when discomfort arises, you immediately look for ways to minimize it, that you're more comfortable solving problems than sitting with questions. Those are coping skills. They're useful, but they're not meant to replace presence. Letting go of the coping version doesn't mean abandoning discipline or responsibility. It means loosening the grip. It means allowing yourself to respond differently when the situation no longer requires survival. This is where many people hesitate, because letting go feels like losing control. But control is often the cost of coping. You control yourself tightly so life doesn't surprise you. And in doing so, you limit what life can offer. Letting go is not reckless, it's responsive. It means checking in instead of defaulting. Asking, is this actually an emergency or just familiar discomfort? Do I need to endure or can I adjust? Am I coping out of necessity or habit? Those questions don't dismantle stability, they refine it. You're not being asked to discard the coping version of you. You're being asked to thank it, to recognize how it served you, and to let it step back when it's no longer needed. Because that version has been working overtime. It's tired. And you may be tired too. Not because life is overwhelming, because you've been carrying more than necessary for longer than required. Letting go doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments. When you allow yourself to feel something without immediately fixing it. When you admit uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. When you notice discomfort and ask what it's asking for instead of silencing it. Those moments are subtle. They don't look like transformation. They look like permission. Permission to respond differently. Permission to rest internally. Permission to let the coping version stand down just a little. This chapter isn't about becoming someone else. It's about expanding who you already are. You can still be capable, still be disciplined, still be responsible, but you don't have to be in survival mode to live a stable life. Stability that includes ease is not weakness, it's growth. And letting go of the version that copes isn't loss. It's relief. Relief that comes from recognizing that you don't need to brace yourself anymore. Not for everything, not all the time. And as that grip loosens, something else becomes possible. Presence, clarity, a different way of living that doesn't require constant endurance. That's where the next chapter leads. Chapter 15, What Honesty Actually Requires. When people think about honesty, they often imagine confession, saying something out loud, admitting something publicly, making a declaration. That idea alone is enough to make honesty feel overwhelming, because confession implies consequences, reactions, changes you might not be ready for. So people avoid honesty altogether. But honesty doesn't begin out loud. It begins internally, quietly, without witnesses, without announcements. Honesty is not about telling the truth to others. It's about stopping the habit of lying to yourself in small, socially acceptable ways. Lies like, it's not that bad. I don't really care. This is just how life is. I'll deal with it later. Those aren't malicious lies. They're coping statements. They help you get through the day. But when they become automatic, they disconnect you from your actual experience. Honesty doesn't require courage at first. It requires attention. Attention to what you feel before you edit it. Attention to reactions you normally explain away. Attention to the gap between what you say and what you experience. This kind of honesty doesn't ask you to fix anything. In fact, trying to fix things too quickly is often another way of avoiding honesty. Fixing rushes past discomfort. Honesty sits with it. You might notice something as simple as a heaviness when you think about your week. Instead of telling yourself, it's fine, honesty asks, what does this heaviness belong to? You might notice boredom, irritation, or resistance. Instead of suppressing it, honesty allows it to exist without judgment. This is uncomfortable at first, because you're used to managing your inner world, not observing it. You're used to steering away from discomfort, not letting it speak. So when you stop interfering, feelings surface that have been waiting a long time. Not dramatic feelings, ordinary ones. Fatigue, disappointment, uncertainty, longing. Honesty doesn't demand that you act on these feelings. It just asks that you stop arguing with them. Most people don't realize how much energy they spend negotiating with themselves, convincing themselves to be okay, convincing themselves to keep going, convincing themselves that what they feel isn't important. That negotiation is exhausting. Honesty ends the negotiation, says, this is what's here. Nothing more, nothing less. That's why honesty feels relieving even when it's uncomfortable. Because it removes the pressure to justify your experience. You don't need to prove that your feelings are valid. They already exist. Honesty also doesn't require consistency. You don't need to feel the same way every day. You don't need to settle on a narrative. You're allowed to feel conflicted, grateful and dissatisfied, capable and tired, committed and uncertain. Honesty allows complexity, and complexity is closer to truth than clarity ever is. This is where many people get stuck. They think they need clarity before they can be honest. But clarity often comes after honesty. When you stop forcing coherence, patterns emerge naturally. You start noticing what consistently drains you, what repeatedly excites you, what you avoid thinking about. Those patterns don't require interpretation. They reveal themselves. Honesty is patient. It doesn't rush you toward conclusions. It doesn't demand decisions. It simply creates a relationship with yourself that isn't adversarial. You stop treating your feelings like obstacles. You start treating them like information. This changes how you experience your life. You may find that certain things feel heavier once you stop denying it. That's not regression. That's awareness. You may also notice moments of lightness where you didn't expect them. Moments of clarity, moments of relief, moments of quiet excitement. Honesty makes room for those too. Because when you stop suppressing discomfort, you also stop suppressing desire. Both return together. This chapter isn't about telling the truth to anyone else. It's about creating an internal environment where the truth is allowed to exist without punishment, where you don't rush to correct yourself, where you don't shame yourself for wanting more, where you don't dismiss your own reactions. That environment changes how you relate to everything else. Decisions become clearer, not because you force them, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. Energy returns, not because life changes overnight, but because internal resistance decreases. You feel more present, not because circumstances improve, but because you're no longer split between what you feel and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. Honesty doesn't solve problems, it reveals them. And revelation is the first step toward alignment, not action, alignment, which is quieter, more sustainable, more honest. This chapter is an invitation to practice honesty gently, without urgency, without demands, without turning it into another responsibility. Just noticing, just listening, just allowing yourself to experience what's already there. That's enough. And it leads naturally to the next shift. Chapter 16. The space between knowing and acting. Once you start being honest with yourself, something strange happens. You know more, but you don't necessarily do more. You see patterns, you recognize misalignment, you understand what isn't working, And yet your life may look exactly the same from the outside. This is where many people panic. They assume something is wrong. They tell themselves, if I really knew the truth, I'd act on it. If I really wanted change, I'd do something by now. If nothing is changing, I must be avoiding it. So they pressure themselves. They turn awareness into another task. They start asking, what's my next move? Before the ground beneath them has settled. But there is a necessary phase between knowing and acting. A quiet phase. A confusing phase. A phase where clarity exists without momentum. And that phase is not failure. It's integration. When you've lived a long time disconnected from your internal signals, awareness arrives gently. It doesn't immediately translate into action because your nervous system needs time to recalibrate. You're unlearning habits, unwinding identities, releasing coping strategies that once felt essential. That takes time. And during that time, it may feel like you're standing still, but you're not. You're reorganizing internally. You're letting truth settle without forcing conclusions. You're allowing your system to experience honesty without immediately demanding change. This space feels uncomfortable because it lacks a script. You're no longer fully asleep, but not yet fully awake. You can't go back to pretending, but moving forward feels unclear. So you hover, and hovering feels unproductive in a culture that values motion. We're taught that insight should lead to action quickly, that awareness should be followed by a plan, but internal change doesn't follow productivity rules. It follows nervous system rules. You don't overhaul a life by force, you allow it to reorganize. This space often feels like uncertainty. You may notice fluctuating motivation, moments of clarity followed by doubt, days where you feel grounded, followed by days where you feel lost again. That doesn't mean you're regressing. It means your internal map is updating. Old reference points no longer apply. New ones haven't fully formed, so things feel unsteady. This is the moment when many people retreat. They decide awareness is too uncomfortable. They go back to distractions, back to routines, back to numbing. Not because they were wrong, because the in-between feels exposed. But staying here, gently, is powerful. Because this is where automatic behavior loosens. When you stop forcing yourself to act, you start noticing what naturally pulls at you. What ideas return repeatedly, what thoughts don't leave, what directions feel lighter when you imagine them. Those signals are subtle. They can't be heard if you rush. Action that comes too early is often reactive. Action that comes after integration is aligned. This chapter is permission to pause without shame, to let awareness do its work, to stop measuring progress by visible change. Because real change often begins invisibly, in how you relate to your thoughts, in how you respond to discomfort, in how you allow yourself to not know. Knowing without acting doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you're listening. And listening changes things quietly. It changes what you tolerate, what you question, what you dismiss. Eventually, without forcing, action begins to feel less heavy, not urgent, clear, not dramatic, natural. You don't push yourself into it. You find yourself moving. This chapter isn't telling you to wait forever. It's telling you not to rush yourself out of a necessary phase. The space between knowing and acting is where alignment forms. And alignment makes action sustainable. When action finally comes, it won't feel like pressure. It will feel like relief, like responding instead of forcing, like moving with yourself instead of against yourself. And that's where the next chapter leads. Chapter 17, Choosing Discomfort instead of numbness. For a long time, numbness feels like relief. Not relief in a good way, but relief from intensity. When you stop feeling deeply, you stop hurting deeply. You stop hoping too much. You stop being disappointed as often. Numbness is efficient. It allows you to function without interruption. It smooths the sharp edges of life. It makes things manageable. That's why so many people live there without realizing it. They're not sad. They're not happy. They're just neutral. And neutrality feels safe. It doesn't demand anything. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't challenge routines. But over time, numbness becomes exhausting. Not because it hurts, but because it drains color from everything. Joy becomes muted. Curiosity fades. Connection feels distant. You're present, but not fully alive. That's often when people start saying they're tired. Not physically tired, existentially tired. When awareness returns, feeling returns with it. And this is where many people get confused. They expect relief, but instead they feel discomfort. Old emotions surface. Restlessness increases. Uncertainty grows louder. And they think something has gone wrong. They assume they've made things worse. In reality, they've made things honest. Feeling is messy. It doesn't arrive organized. It doesn't follow a timeline. It doesn't care about convenience. When numbness lifts, discomfort comes first. Because discomfort was always there, just muted. Now it's audible. This is the moment where people are tempted to go back. Back to distraction, back to routine, back to telling themselves everything is fine. Because numbness, for all its emptiness, is predictable. Discomfort is not. Discomfort makes you aware of misalignment. It highlights what doesn't fit. It brings attention to choices you've postponed. And that can feel overwhelming. So people ask the wrong question. They ask us, how do I get rid of this feeling? Instead of asking, what is this feeling asking me to notice? Discomfort isn't punishment. It's guidance. It's the body's way of saying something matters. Numbness is what happens when feeling is ignored long enough. Discomfort is what happens when feeling is allowed back in. Choosing discomfort doesn't mean choosing suffering. It means choosing awareness over avoidance. It means allowing yourself to feel friction instead of suppressing it. That friction is informative. It tells you where you're stretched too thin, where you're overextended, where you're living slightly off-center. This chapter isn't encouraging you to seek discomfort. It's encouraging you not to fear it. Because discomfort is temporary. Numbness tends to be chronic. Discomfort moves, it shifts, it changes shape. Numbness stagnates. People often say they want peace, but peace doesn't come from numbing yourself. It comes from allowing yourself to feel fully and respond honestly. The first stage of that is uncomfortable because you're learning a new internal language. You're relearning how to listen to signals you've ignored. And listening feels vulnerable. You might feel exposed, more sensitive, less certain. That's not weakness. That's recalibration. Your system is waking up. And waking up doesn't feel calm at first. It feels disorienting. But orientation follows. If you don't shut it down, if you don't rush to escape, if you let discomfort speak without immediately trying to solve it. Over time, something shifts. The discomfort becomes less chaotic, more specific, more directional. It stops feeling like noise and starts feeling like information. You begin to recognize the difference between discomfort that signals growth and discomfort that signals harm. You learn which feelings are asking for courage and which are asking for rest. That discernment only comes through experience, not avoidance. Choosing discomfort over numbness is not a dramatic decision. It's a series of small permissions. Permission to feel bored instead of distracted. Permission to feel restless instead of sedated. Permission to feel uncertain instead of pretending you're sure. Those permissions reconnect you to yourself, and connection restores energy, not instantly, but sustainably. This chapter is an invitation to stop treating discomfort as the enemy, and to recognize numbness as the signal it actually is. A signal that something meaningful has been postponed for too long. Feeling again may not be pleasant at first, but it's real, and real is where life begins to return. Quietly, gradually, without forcing. Chapter 18, Redefining Stability. For a long time, stability meant one thing: predictability, knowing what tomorrow would look like, knowing what was expected of you, knowing how your days would unfold. Stability felt like safety. It meant your bills were paid, your routines were set, your responsibilities were manageable. And there is real value in that. Stability creates a foundation, it reduces stress, it allows you to plan. But somewhere along the way, stability became rigid. It stopped being a base to build from and became something to cling to. You may notice that when people talk about stability, they often mean immobility, staying in the same job, maintaining the same routines, keeping things exactly as they are, even when those things quietly drain them. Because stability became synonymous with don't rock the boat. And rocking the boat feels dangerous when your life is built on balance. So you learn to equate change with risk. You assume that stability and growth are opposites. That if you change something, you lose control. That if you experiment, you invite chaos. That if you adjust course, you threaten everything you've built. But that version of stability is fragile. It only works as long as nothing shifts, and life always shifts. People change, needs change, values evolve. So when stability is defined as nothing can change, it requires constant effort to maintain. You spend energy protecting the structure instead of living inside it. You resist natural transitions. You suppress signals that something needs adjusting. You prioritize maintenance over meaning. That's when stability becomes exhausting. Not because stability is bad, because it's been misunderstood. True stability isn't about freezing your life in place. It's about resilience, the ability to adapt without collapse, the ability to adjust without panic, the ability to respond instead of react. Stability that includes flexibility is stronger than the stability that depends on sameness. But flexibility requires trust. Trust in yourself. Trust in your capacity to handle uncertainty. Trust that you won't lose everything if one thing changes. Many people don't trust that yet, not because they're incapable, because they've spent years equating safety with control. Control feels reassuring. It creates the illusion that if you manage everything correctly, nothing will go wrong. But control has limits. And when those limits are reached, exhaustion follows. Redefining stability means asking a different question. Not, how do I keep everything the same, but what allows me to feel grounded even when things shift? Groundedness doesn't come from rigid routines. It comes from self-trust, from knowing that you can listen to yourself, that you can adapt when needed, that you can recalibrate without losing your footing. This kind of stability doesn't depend on circumstances staying constant. It depends on your relationship with change. You may notice that the most grounded people aren't the ones whose lives never change. They're the ones who respond to change without losing themselves. They don't panic when something feels off. They don't ignore discomfort until it explodes. They make small adjustments before things become unmanageable. That's stability, quiet, responsive, alive. This chapter isn't asking you to destabilize your life. It's asking you to loosen the belief that stability requires stagnation. Because when stability excludes growth, growth finds other ways to surface. Through burnout, through resentment, through disengagement. Those aren't failures. They're signals that your definition of stability needs updating. You're allowed to want a stable life that also feels alive. You're allowed to have routines that support you instead of confine you. You're allowed to redefine success in a way that includes energy, presence, and alignment. Stability isn't about never feeling uncertain. It's about trusting yourself through uncertainty. And trust grows when you allow yourself to make small, honest adjustments. Not dramatic changes, honest ones. This chapter is an invitation to rethink what you've been protecting, and to ask whether the thing you've been calling stability is actually serving you, or just keeping everything familiar. Because familiarity isn't the same as safety, and safety isn't the same as peace. Peace comes from alignment, from living in a way that doesn't require constant self-suppression, from allowing stability to breathe. That's where the final chapters lead. Chapter 19, you're allowed to want a different life. At some point, wanting a different life started to feel dangerous. Not because you wanted something reckless, not because you wanted to abandon everything, but because the desire itself felt like a violation of gratitude, a violation of responsibility, a violation of the person you worked hard to become. So you learned to soften it. You told yourself you didn't really want a different life, just a break, just more rest, just less pressure. You reframed the desire until it sounded acceptable. But underneath the softer language, the truth stayed the same. You wanted your days to feel different. You wanted your energy to return. You wanted to feel like your life belonged to you again. And every time that truth surfaced, guilt followed. Guilt for not being satisfied. Guilt for wanting more when others struggle. Guilt for imagining something else when your life is fine. That guilt didn't come from selfishness. It came from loyalty. Loyalty to your past effort. Loyalty to your commitments. Loyalty to the version of you that endured when things were hard. You didn't want to invalidate that. So you tried to silence the desire instead. But desire doesn't disappear when it's silenced. It waits. It shows up as restlessness, as boredom, as a low-grade dissatisfaction that doesn't go away. And because there's no obvious crisis, you assume the problem is you, that you should be more content, more appreciative, more disciplined. But wanting a different life doesn't mean your current one is wrong. It means you've changed. And change is not betrayal, it's development. The person you are now is not the person who made all your past decisions. That doesn't make those decisions mistakes. It makes them time-specific. They fit who you were then. They may not fit who you are now. You're allowed to acknowledge that without rewriting your history as a failure. You're allowed to want something different without hating what you have. This is where many people get stuck. They believe desire requires rejection, that wanting a different life means rejecting their current one entirely. But desire is rarely that extreme. Most of the time, it's directional. It says, this part doesn't fit anymore. This rhythm drains me. This version of success feels empty. It doesn't say, burn everything down. But when guilt enters, you stop listening to nuance. You reduce desire to a threat instead of information. And information ignored doesn't stop informing. It just communicates through discomfort instead of clarity. This chapter is about releasing the moral judgment attached to wanting differently. You are not ungrateful for noticing misalignment. You are not disloyal for evolving. You are not irresponsible for imagining a life that feels more like yours. Wanting a different life doesn't mean you need to act immediately. It doesn't mean you owe anyone an explanation. It means you allow the desire to exist without punishing yourself for it. That alone is a shift. Because once desire is no longer treated as a problem, it becomes clearer. It stops shouting. It stops hiding. It becomes specific. You start noticing what you want more of, not just what you want less of. More spaciousness, more autonomy, more creativity, more presence. Those aren't unreasonable wants. They're human ones. And when you allow yourself to want them without guilt, you stop fighting yourself internally. That fight has been costing you energy, more than you realized. You don't need permission from life to want something different. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to turn it into a plan. You just need to stop treating it like a flaw. This chapter is an invitation to let go of the idea that desire is something you must earn. You don't earn the right to want alignment. You discover it, quietly, through honesty, through attention, through noticing what drains you and what restores you. That noticing doesn't destabilize your life, it grounds it. Because a life built without listening eventually demands attention. A life built with listening evolves more gently. You're allowed to want a different life, not because your current one is broken, but because you're alive. And being alive means responding to change, not resisting it indefinitely. This permission doesn't demand action. It offers relief. Relief from arguing with yourself. Relief from carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. Relief from pretending desire is a threat. And in that relief, something settles. Something honest, something calm. And that calm is what the final chapter rests in. Chapter 20. You don't need to decide today. There is a quiet relief in realizing you don't need to decide anything today. Not about your job, not about your future, not about who you're becoming. After everything you've noticed, everything you've felt, and everything you've allowed back into awareness, there can be a subtle pressure to do something, to act, to change, to resolve the tension. But resolution doesn't always come through action. Sometimes it comes through permission. Permission to pause without backsliding. Permission to sit in clarity without turning it into urgency. Permission to let awareness settle into your life naturally. You don't need to make a move to honor what you've learned. You've already honored it by listening. For many people, this is the hardest part to accept. They've been trained to believe that insight without action is wasted. That understanding something means you must immediately respond. But that belief is part of what made things heavy in the first place. The pressure to perform, the pressure to optimize, the pressure to constantly improve. This book wasn't about improvement. It was about alignment. And alignment doesn't come from forcing yourself forward. It comes from removing what no longer fits. That removal doesn't happen overnight. It happens quietly. You begin to notice your limits sooner. You stop explaining yourself as much. You hesitate before committing to things that drain you. These changes don't look dramatic. They look subtle, but they add up. Decisions become easier not because life simplifies, but because you're no longer negotiating with yourself internally. You know when something costs too much. You know when something feels right. You trust your signals more, and trust changes how you move. You don't need a grand plan to live differently. You need presence. Presence with your days. Presence with your energy. Presence with what feels honest in the moment. From that presence, choices emerge naturally. Not perfect choices, honest ones. This chapter is here to remind you that clarity doesn't demand immediacy. You can carry what you've learned into your life slowly. You can let it influence how you show up without turning it into a project. You don't need to decide who you'll be 5 years from now. You only need to notice how you're living today. Notice where you're forcing yourself. Notice where you're drained. Notice where you feel a sense of quiet relief. Those notices are enough. They guide you without pressure. They allow your life to shift at a pace your nervous system can handle. Because lasting change doesn't come from dramatic declarations. It comes from small, consistent acts of honesty. From choosing not to abandon yourself in moments where you used to. From listening instead of overriding. From allowing yourself to be human instead of constantly functional. You didn't hate your life. You were tired of pretending. And pretending ends not with a decision, but with awareness. Awareness you now have. You don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to justify your experience. You just need to stay connected to yourself. That connection will do the rest, quietly, gradually, in a way that doesn't require collapse or conflict, just honesty, just presence, just permission, and that's enough. Bonus chapter. Learning how to keep going without losing yourself. There's a quiet misunderstanding about what it means to keep going. Most people think keeping going means pushing, holding on, enduring, forcing yourself forward even when you're empty. But that's not actually keeping going. That's surviving. Keeping going in a sustainable way looks different. It looks like learning how to move through life without abandoning yourself every time things get uncomfortable. Most people were never taught how to do that. They were taught how to cope, how to perform, how to be productive, how to be useful. They were taught how to keep going for everyone else, not how to keep going with themselves still intact. So when life gets heavy, they default to effort. They push harder. They tighten control. They silence doubt. They suppress feeling. And for a while that works, until it doesn't. Because effort without alignment always leads to exhaustion. This bonus chapter isn't about motivation. It's about endurance done differently. Endurance that doesn't cost you your inner life. The first shift happens when you stop seeing rest as something you earn. Most people treat rest like a reward, something you're allowed to have after everything is handled. But life is never fully handled. There is always another responsibility, another obligation, another reason to delay rest. So rest keeps getting postponed. And when it does happen, it's shallow, distracted, not restorative. Real rest isn't just physical, it's psychological. It's the relief that comes from not having to pretend, from not having to explain, from not having to brace yourself internally. Many people don't realize how tense they are until they stop. They don't notice how often they're holding their breath emotionally, how often they're preparing for something to go wrong, how often they're anticipating disappointment. That vigilance drains you, and no amount of sleep fixes vigilance. The next shift happens when you stop confusing discipline with self-denial. Discipline gets praise, self-denial gets mistaken for maturity, so people override themselves constantly. They ignore signals. They push through resistance. They tell themselves it doesn't matter how they feel. But discipline that requires constant self-neglect is not strength. It's unsustainable. Real discipline includes listening. It includes knowing when to push and when to pause, when effort is needed and when it's counterproductive, when endurance is required and when adjustment is wiser. That discernment doesn't come from rules. It comes from presence. Presence with your energy. Presence with your reactions. Presence with the difference between discomfort that leads to growth and discomfort that signals misalignment. This is how you keep going without breaking. You stop asking, how much can I handle? And start asking, what's actually necessary? Necessary effort feels different than habitual effort. Necessary effort has direction. Habitual effort is just momentum. Most people are exhausted not because life is too hard, but because they're carrying things they no longer need to. Old expectations, old roles, old standards they outgrew, but never questioned. Letting go of those doesn't make you irresponsible. It makes you efficient. You conserve energy for what matters instead of wasting it on maintaining an image. Another shift happens when you redefine progress. Progress isn't always visible. Sometimes progress looks like not reacting the way you used to, saying no faster, noticing exhaustion earlier, recovering quicker after emotional strain. Those changes don't show up on a resume. They don't impress anyone. They don't look dramatic, but they compound. They change how you experience your days. Progress that looks quiet often lasts longer than progress that looks impressive. This chapter is also about learning how to live without constant internal commentary. Many people narrate their lives endlessly. They judge themselves. They critique their feelings. They analyze every reaction. That commentary creates distance from experience. You're always observing instead of living. Learning how to keep going includes learning when to stop narrating, to feel without explaining, to experience without immediately labeling, to exist without turning everything into a problem to solve. That doesn't make you passive. It makes you present. Presence restores energy. Finally, keeping going means letting your life evolve at the speed of honesty, not the speed of fear, not the speed of comparison, not the speed of external pressure. The speed of honesty is slower, but it's steadier. You make fewer dramatic changes, but you make fewer reversals too. You don't lunge forward, you adjust. You don't abandon yourself to reach the next phase. You bring yourself with you. That's the kind of endurance that lasts. This bonus chapter isn't here to inspire you. It's here to normalize a different way of living, a way that doesn't require burnout as a rite of passage, a way that doesn't demand sacrifice of self as proof of worth, a way that allows you to keep going without losing who you are. You don't need to be tougher. You don't need to try harder. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to stop fighting yourself. And when that fight ends, energy returns, clarity returns, presence returns. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to stay connected. Enough to live without pretending.